Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan. Really happy to have all of you with us today. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil mursaleen Sayyidina Mohammed wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. The topic of corporate governance must have been really very intriguing to many of you. And from the number of participants and number of registrations that we've had, it really seems that, yes, there is quite a big interest in this particular topic. But before we carry on, let's listen to a very beautiful verse from the Holy Quran, verse number 177 from Surah Baqarah.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. ليس البر أن تولوا وجوهكم قبل المشرق والمغرب ولكن البر من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر والكتاب والنبيين وآتى المال على حبه ذوي القربى واليتامى والمساكين وابن السبيل والسائلين وفي الرقاب وأقام الصلاة وآتى الزكاة والموفون بعهدهم إذا عاهدوا والصابرين في البأساء والضراء وحين البأس أولئك الذين صدقوا وأولئك هم المتقون.
Sadaqallahu al-Azim. Sadaqallahu al-Azim. Really a very beautiful rendition and a very beautiful verse, and I must say that it is really one of my favorite verses from the Holy Quran, alhamdulillah. So COVID-19 has forced us to go the webinar route. We were trying very hard earlier on to get this as a seminar to a lot of people here locally. But alhamdulillah, I think COVID-19 has pushed us into a webinar mode, and we were able to get people not only from South Africa, but around the country and around the world as well. So alhamdulillah, we have people from various countries that have joined us. I would like to give a special welcome also to all our guest speakers, our panelists, and our attendees there, and particularly Dr. Umar Hafiz, who is from Saudi Arabia and who's also the president of the World AWQAF Forum. Just before we carry on, I think we need to get some house rules sorted out. So at the moment, all attendees and participants are muted for voice and video. Your questions can be posed during the Q&A or using the Q&A feature that is at the bottom of your screen. And these questions will be sent to the program director, and the session will be live streamed on the AWQAF SA Facebook page, and you can refer to that later on. So I think without much ado, I'm going to introduce you to our first speaker. But by the way, in terms of our program, so we have the lead speaker, we have a second speaker, Suleman Badat, then we have Faizel Suleman as a second speaker, and then we'll open it up to our esteemed panelists who are also on the panel at the moment. And then thereafter, we'll have a Q&A session. After the Q&A session, if you've got any recommendations for any way forward or any point that you would like to actually mention as something that needs to be noted for future implementation, I think you can also make your recommendations for that. So let me introduce you first to our first speaker, Brother Suleman Badat. Brother Suleman Badat is a chartered accountant and currently practices as a governance consultant. He also served as a non-executive director on the boards of 2 state-owned entities. He is a past member of the King Committee on Corporate Governance. And if many of us know that the King Committee has been really in the forefront of corporate governance in South Africa, and to the extent that now all JSE, Johannesburg Stock Exchange companies, have to have some statement on their financial statements about their compliance with the King Code. So over to Brother Suleman Badat, the floor is yours. Okay, so Suleman needs to be unmuted.
Okay. Jazakallah Zainul. I presume you can all hear me. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. It gives me great pleasure to be here. In the short time I have been given, my presentation will provide you with a high-level overview of what good governance for NPOs is about, including the drivers for good governance and outcomes, and also to inform you about an NPO governance code that will soon be launched, inshallah. Okay. Let's begin our conversation with what are the key drivers for good governance in NPOs. In other words, why leaders of NPOs must concern themselves with good governance. Firstly, research studies show a high NPO failure rate. One such study in the US reveals that 30% of NPOs cease to exist after 10 years. An article in Forbes magazine claims that 50% of NPOs are set up to fail. I'm sure you will agree that these are indeed scary statistics. Most of the reasons advanced for this concerning state of affairs relate to poor governance. They include the lack of a strategic plan, poor leadership, poor internal control systems, lack of succession planning, etc. All of these causes are also prevalent in local NPOs. So in my opinion, it is not unreasonable to assume that even locally, there is a high failure rate in the NPO sector. I must also emphasize that each one of these causes of failure are avoidable through good governance practices. The second key driver is our obligation to comply with good governance principles enshrined in the Sharia, which includes striving for excellence in whatever we do. Thirdly, the leadership of NPOs have a responsibility to protect the image and the reputation of the Muslim community at large. Fortunately, there have been no recent high-profile Islamic NPO governance scandals that I'm aware of. But can you imagine what damage one of these could cause to the Islamic NPO sector? Finally, remember the leadership of NPOs will need to account to Allah Ta'ala for how we executed our responsibilities and managed the affairs of our organizations. For these reasons, I put it to you, brothers and sisters, that implementing good governance in our NPOs is non-negotiable. The King IV Code on Corporate Governance defines governance as the exercise of ethical and effective leadership by the governing body. There are many definitions of governance, but for purposes of the NPO code that is being produced, we chose to adopt this one. As many of you will know, the King Code is a proudly South African product and is recognized as a leading governance code globally. It also includes a supplement that deals specifically with NPOs. The governing body is the structure that has primary accountability for the governance and performance of the organization. In the NPO context, the governing body could be the board of trustees or the board of directors or the executive committee of an association. The definition emphasizes that the governing body is the focal point and custodian of governance in the organization. That is where the buck stops. the performance of the governing body will ultimately determine whether an NPO will succeed or fail. Many of you must have heard the saying that a fish rots from the head. If the governing body does not provide ethical and effective leadership, the entire organization will suffer. The corporate sector is littered with examples of this. Locally, VBS Bank, Steinhoff, and SAA, to name a few. In terms of King 4, these are the ethical leadership traits that are expected from both individual members of the governing body as well as the governing body as a collective. And they include integrity, competence, responsibility, accountability, fairness, and transparency. Effective leadership is results-driven. It is about achieving the highest level of performance. On performance, I read an article recently which states that, and I quote, millennials, who currently make up more than 50% of the consumer population globally, and who NPOs increasingly rely on for donations, hate waste and inefficiency with a passion. They will run away from poorly performing organizations. By the way, this change in the donor profile and donor expectations should be a strategic risk for many NPOs. This slide presents what governance means for an Islamic NPO. There is nothing un-Islamic about the King 4 definition, and so we embrace it. But that is not enough. And so we add servant leadership, which is a leadership style where the main purpose of the leaders of an NPO is to serve humanity solely for the pleasure of Allah Ta'ala. Servant leadership is exemplified by dedication, commitment, compassion, and taqwa. Serving on the governing body of an NPO must never be for name and fame's sake. Next, we add Sharia governance principles not covered by King 4, which include consultation, shura, justice, adl, trust, amana, and excellence, ihsan. So from an Islamic NPO perspective, governance is the exercise of ethical, effective, and servant leadership in accordance with Sharia. These are the elements of a typical NPO governance ecosystem. And there are many elements to the governance ecosystem, as can be seen from the slide. Now, the governing body, and I refer them in this context as the conductor of the orchestra, must ensure that all of these instruments work in an effective and harmonious manner to achieve good governance. And the cause of all governance failures are rooted in the ineffectiveness in one or more of these elements. So for example, the root cause of fraud and theft, to which many NPOs are exposed, lies in ineffective internal controls and the lack of an ethical culture. Similarly, the recent scandals relating to sexual exploitation of women and children by prominent NGOs such as Oxfam, UNICEF, and International Red Cross are rooted in the failure of their policies, values, culture, and leadership. Policies. Policies establish the rules of conduct within the NPO. Broadly speaking, they set out what is allowed and what is not allowed. Many NPOs I have dealt with do not have formal written policies. In the absence of such, I can tell you from experience that even small decisions become a source of tension and conflict within the governing body, such as whether or not to give an employee a loan or whether or not to allow a trustee to use the NPO's baqi for his or her personal use. So my key message here is that all of these elements must be working effectively to achieve good governance. Good governance will result in the following outcomes. Firstly, and most importantly, Allah Ta'ala will be pleased with the governing body. It will result in good performance and efficient service delivery. It will result in an ethical culture characterized by honesty, integrity, and people doing the right things with Allah consciousness. A strong system of internal controls and risk management. A good reputation. They say that a good reputation is earned in drops, but lost in buckets. Finally, trusting stakeholders, which includes donors, who are happy to contribute to the NPO with confidence that their money will be safeguarded and used for the intended purpose.
Can I just interrupt there quickly? We have a poll there on the screen. So we're just asking all attendees there to give a quick vote whether your NPO have a documented strategy for governance. Jazakallah. Suleman, you may continue.
Thank you,
Sorry
Zainul.
for the interruption.
Okay, I'm trying to get to the next slide. Yeah. Okay. A governance code for Islamic NPOs is at an advanced stage of development. The primary objective of the code is to promote good governance through providing guidance on leading governance practices. Its adoption by NPOs will be on a voluntary basis. Proportional implementation means that the leading practices recommended in the code may not be suitable and appropriate for all NPOs. And so the recommended practices must be scaled and tweaked for each NPO, taking into account its size and complexity of operations. So this will not be a one-size-fits-all code. Project sponsors for the code are AWQAF, AMAL, SANZAF, and UUCSA. In the interest of time, I will share with you just a few recommended principles and related practices from this draft code. And the first one deals with the composition of the governing body, which many NPOs do not pay sufficient attention to, in spite of what I said earlier, that it is the governing body that ultimately will determine whether the NPO succeeds or fails. Typically what happens is that the founder appoints people to the governing body who he or she knows, with little regard to what skills they will bring. And so the code advocates that the governing body should be made up of an appropriate balance of skills, experience, knowledge, diversity, and independence. And the code also provides some recommended practices on how to achieve this, such as the establishment of a periodic rotation plan for governing body members to ensure that new members with new expertise and fresh perspectives are introduced while retaining knowledge and skills and experience of older members. And this really serves to challenge the trustee for life thinking. Effective succession planning is what is recommended so that the NPO does not die when the founder dies. A transparent and consultative appointment process is also recommended. The next principle of the NPO being a responsible corporate citizen requires that whilst an NPO is going about executing its business, it must have due regard for what the King 4 Code refers to as the triple context, namely economy, society, and environment. So for society, for example, the NPO must be seen to be caring about societal issues such as community development, health and safety of employees and the public, development of employees, and basic human rights. As far as environment goes, it does not help when the unintended consequences of the soup kitchen we run is discarded polystyrene containers polluting the environment. The final principle I want to share with you is that the governing body should adopt a stakeholder inclusive approach. And the recommended practices here to achieve that is that the governing body should define who its key and material stakeholders are, to develop a stakeholder relationship management plan for each of these stakeholders, and to continually monitor the effectiveness of stakeholder management. As can be seen from this slide, an NPO operates in a complex ecosystem with many stakeholders, both internal and external. Some of these include beneficiaries, donors, directors and trustees, community, volunteers, media, banks, government agencies, etc., etc. And these stakeholders have different and sometimes conflicting expectations from the NPO. So for example, it could happen that a major donor wants to sponsor a project that the community is unhappy with, such as a feeding scheme in a residential area. The governing body in this case needs to balance the needs, interests, and expectations of all stakeholders and should try its best not to prioritize the interests of one or more stakeholders to the detriment of others. In conclusion, Islamic NPOs have a more onerous responsibility for good governance. Good governance is the foundation of NPO success and sustainability, and the Governance Code, inshallah, will provide guidance on good governance practices. Shukran, and with that, I will hand back to you, Brother Zainal.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan, Brother Suleman. Thank you so much. I think from what you've said, there must be a lot of questions, and there have been many questions that have come up already. But I just want to remind all the participants out there that there will be an opportunity to address all those questions and answers during the Q&A session, but we are making note of all your questions. Jazakallah. So we go on to our next presenter, Brother Faizel Suleman. Brother Faizel Suleman is a qualified chartered accountant as well. He specializes in taxation and auditing. He's a member of the Council of the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, and he is also a committee member of the National Small and Medium Practice Committee. So over to you, Brother Suleman, Brother Faizel. Jazakallah. I think Brother Faizel's presentation will be focusing mainly on taxation.
Welcome to all the listeners and the participants. Thank you for this opportunity. My colleague Suleman Badat has done quite an extensive presentation on the importance of corporate governance, and it is my pleasure to present on the tax and disclosure. As PBOs, we should love SARS, as there are so many opportunities provided that allow benefits that would assist in funding the organization's activities. However, we need to ensure that we comply with the various acts. SARS have highlighted recently the non-compliance of PBOs. To prevent malpractice and abuse of these benefits, various compliance measures exist, and furthermore, numerous punitive measures have been introduced in the tax acts to deal with situations in which the NPO misuses these benefits or does not comply as required. It is therefore imperative that every NPO understands these provisions to obtain maximum benefits and also to ensure that the organization is compliant. So I'm briefly going to touch on these topics: Section 18A and income tax, VAT, PAYE, UIF, COIDA, or as it's more commonly known, workman's compensation, and the accounting aspects. PBOs and taxes, in my opinion, and like I said, we should love taxes. At the same time, PBOs are government's helping hand, and in various areas, for example, education, healthcare, poverty alleviation, etc. One of the opportunities for PBOs is Section 18A activities, and this basically allows donors who make donations to certain activities of a PBO to get a deduction. These activities are listed in Part 2 of the 9th Schedule of the Income Tax Act and are commonly referred to as Section 18A activities. These are some of the areas in which PBOs assist and in which they can issue Section 18A receipts. Section 18A approved organizations are required to maintain proper control over the application and spending of donations received for which a Section 18A receipt has been issued. A Section 18A receipt may be used only for a donation which is solely and exclusively used for Section 18 activities conducted in South Africa, and rightly so. It is therefore imperative to track donations received and used for Section 18A activities separately to that received and used for non-Section 18A receipts. A new requirement that has been introduced by SARS is an audit certificate which must be obtained and retained, confirming that all donations received where Section 18A receipts have been issued were used solely for carrying on Section 18A activities. Next is income tax. Now, as I say there, PBOs pay 0% income tax, but there's a responsibility. The first part is that all PBOs must register with South African Revenue Service as a tax-exempt entity. PBOs are required to submit annual tax returns even if there is a nil tax return. The tax return is to be signed by an authorized person, and penalties, fines will apply, and imprisonment if the return is not submitted. Certain PBOs, perform certain functions which are not integral and directly related to the sole or principal object of the PBO. Example, a bookshop. And in that case, the first 200,000 or 5% of turnover is exempt. Thereafter, it is taxed at 28%. Next is VAT. And like I say, we love VAT as PBOs. So a tax-exempt PBO can register for VAT either on a voluntary basis, which conditions apply, or the turnover exceeds R1 million. The PBO may then claim the input VAT on designated items, for example, purchases, electricity, rent, etc. SARS is not going to just part with money, because this could lead to a refund for the PBO. So we must ensure that all the requirements are met. For example, tax invoices comply with the requirements of the VAT Act. If we are employing people, then we have to register for PAYE, provided that the employees are subject to income tax. So basically, what happens is that the PBO will deduct the pay as you earn and then pay it over to SARS. Most PBOs will be exempt from skills development levies, which generally all other enterprises are subject to. Should employees earn above the tax threshold, PAYE must be deducted and paid over to SARS on a monthly basis. An RP5 reconciliation of tax deducted is submitted to SARS on a 6-monthly basis. One of the opportunities is the employer tax incentive. An employer tax incentive is basically where people that are within the ages of 18 and 29 and have not been previously employed are then employed and earn between 2,000 and 6,500 Rand per month. There's basically a scale in which the employer will be receiving an incentive. The incentive is for a 24-month period, which the first 12 months, it gets 100% of the incentive, and in the second 12 months, 50% of that incentive. Once again, all PBOs that employ persons for more than 24 hours per week must register for an employment insurance fund. The contribution is basically 1% from the employer and 1% from the employee. Returns may be submitted for UIF monthly by SARS. UIF provides short-term relief to employees when they become unemployed due to illness, maternity, or dismissal. One of the benefits that we've seen recently is with the lockdown. A lot of organizations were able to claim the UIF on behalf of their staff and pay that over to them. The next is compensation for occupational injuries and diseases, also known as workman's compensation. Once again, all our PBOs must register with COIDA. In the event that staff are injured on duty or pick up an illness, example COVID-19, they will be paid for the duration of the sickness, and the medical expenses will also be covered. In the event of a death of an employee, their heir will be paid up to 2 years of salary. And finally, we talk about the accounting aspect. Suleman spoke about the corporate governance, and one of the critical areas is to maintain proper accounting records. And that is basically of its income and expenses, its assets and liabilities. And then your financial statements must be prepared within 6 months of the financial year end. If you're a PBO, a registered PBO with the Department of Social Development, then you need to submit within 2 months after your financial statements have been prepared, the financial statements as well as the report to the Department of Social Development. Islamic PBOs may have specific disclosure requirements. For example, zakat. Now, zakat is an amanat. We collect those funds and then we are required to dispose of them. Therefore, we need to record them separately. We need to have a dedicated bank account for those funds and to ensure that the requirements in disposing that zakat is met. So in the financial statements itself, we need to record the zakat liability separately and to ensure that the bank account balances to the liability that we have. The alternative is also that we may have special projects, and in these projects, we may want to ring fence those funds and ensure that they're kept separately and disclosed accordingly. In this case as well, we must ensure that the liability is recorded in the financial statements and that a separate dedicated bank account is maintained for this. That's it for me. This is me, Faizel Suleman, F. Suleman and Associates, and a senior member of AMAL. The one disclaimer is that the area of the tax relating to public benefit organizations is complex and would suggest seeking advice from an expert. AMAL, in conjunction with UUCSA and AWQAF, have prepared a compliance checklist for PBOs, which will be sent out to all participants. Thank you. Back to you, Zainul.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan, Brother Faizel. I'd like to just ask Hassanein to put up that poll again. Okay, so this is a corporate governance poll. Would you describe the state of your governance in your organization as acceptable? So you just need to say yes or no, and then we'd be able to get an immediate kind of response from the 199 odd participants that are attending this particular webinar. So yes, corporate governance and taxation is quite important. Many NPOs, and I think Brother Faisal mentioned the word PBO, and for those that are not familiar with that term, it's a public benefit organization, particularly for taxation purposes. While we use the word NPO generally as for non-profit organizations, but the PBO specifically refers for taxation purposes. So hopefully, people have taken note of the importance of taxation and compliance with regard to tax, because it could endanger the organization in terms of the removal from exemption and so forth. So it's important that we do have that particular aspect, sorted out in terms of our compliance and in terms of our own policies and procedures. Okay, what I'd like to do next is introduce to you our panelists. So I'm going to introduce each one, and each one is going to be given 3 minutes to address from their particular perspective. The first panelist is Sheikh Ighsaan Taliep. He is the Chief Director of Academic Affairs of the Islamic Peace College or the Islamic Peace University. He has completed his BA Honours in Islamic Law in 1995. He completed his BCom Law at the University of Western Cape in 1995 and completed the Master of Comparative Law in 2009. He is currently the President of the United Ulama Council of South Africa and a senior member of the Muslim Judicial Council. Over to you, Sheikh Ighsaan.
Just unmuting Uncle Zainul. Am I audible?
Yes, Jazakallah, and welcome.
Jazakumullah khair. Shukran very, very much for the introduction, Uncle Zainul. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ala Rasulillah. In the 3 minutes, inshallah, we hope to be able to reflect from a ulama perspective, but more particularly from a Sharia perspective also on the purpose for our gathering here today and our webinar around governance and of course the ethics related to that, and really as it relates to NPOs or PBOs. I think in the first instance, from a Sharia perspective, when we consider considerations related more particularly to a very sort of contemporary kind of context, where we as Muslim scholars and also from a fiqh perspective, we need to, in a sense, bring synergies and bring kind of almost as it relates to our lived reality. I think the maqasid of the Sharia becomes a very important tool for us to use in this particular context. So when we're talking about the maqasid, we're talking about the higher purposes and the objectives of the Sharia. And when we reflect incidentally on just the purposes of for the existence of PBOs and NPOs, we also find that it is expressly referred to as being serving the public benefit and the public good. And in that sense, there is, of course, a complete synergy with the purposes of the Sharia as well, because again, explicitly al-maslaha al-'amma, which is literally the public benefit, serves really as the basis upon which the Sharia is founded and constructed. And so for the public benefit or organization or the NPO, from the Islamic perspective, one can then say that it really in a current context begins to serve almost as vehicles of da'wah in Islam. And that I think is very critical because considering also that is of course a fundamental principle of the Sharia, da'wah in itself. And so that which is necessary to fulfill da'wah is of course also necessary to be fulfilled. In other words, PBOs and the successful functioning of PBOs, if they are there for the purposes of da'wah, then they should also be fulfilled in the best possible way. And so a maqasid Sharia perspective, I think, reflected on, and I really have a little bit of hesitance using the word corporate governance as opposed to just governance. There is, of course, a conversation going on about corporatization of PBOs, but that's a conversation on its own, perchance for another opportunity. But when we then talk about the ethics of Islam and the ethics that really should govern us in terms of corporate governance considerations, then we're talking about justice. And of course, social justice here is what we are referring to. We're talking about also compassion. In other words, mercy. We're talking also about hikmah, wisdom, and then also the principles of maslahah once again. And so from the Sharia perspective, these, I think, ethics that we want to mobilize and that we would like to put at the service of the project of governance must, of course, also be subjected to the philosophical view of Tawheed in Islam. And that really just governs the way how we as believers are governed in terms of our relations with creation inter se, amongst creation, and then also, of course, very importantly, our relation as creation with the Creator. And all of this, I think, is what is brought together in order to ensure that the PBO and the NPO fulfills its function in the service of humanity, and understanding that, of course, is its main function.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan there, Sheikh Ighsaan. We'll go on to our next speaker, who is Brother Shauket Fakie, and I'm just reminding you again about the poll that's on your screen there. Do you think that a governance code for Islamic NPOs will help to promote good governance? So please answer a yes, no, or maybe. So Brother Shauket Fakie is a qualified chartered accountant in South Africa, 1986, and also in Australia, 1988. In 1999, he was appointed as the Auditor General of South Africa, a very prestigious position that he held for many years, for a 7-year term, in fact. In 2007, he took on the role of Executive and Business Risk Management at MTN, which is our mobile service provider, MTN, until his retirement in 2015. He also served as chairman of the South African National Zakat Fund. So really very esteemed person, and we really appreciate your attending as a panelist on this webinar. Jazakallah khairan, and over to you, Brother Shauket.
Jazakallah Zainul. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I greet the over 200 participants that's on this webinar with the universal greeting. My topic on risk management and internal control, before I talk on that subject matter, I just want to add to the presentation that was made by Suleman Badat on corporate governance and some of the pointers that Sheikh Taliep made reference to from a Sharia point of view. From a Sharia point of view, and what I'd like to add is basically to briefly touch on the spiritual aspects of doing community work and managing NPOs or being in charge of NPOs. The first, and these are principle or the mantra or the mindset that you need to have if you are either doing community work or in charge of NPOs. Firstly, the work you do is for the sake of Allah and for the pleasure of Allah. That's the first principle that you need to have as your mantra. The second one being what work or assistance that you provide to the needy or to the community is done through you and not by you. The third principle is that if you do not get a kick up your backside for the work that you're doing, consider yourself very fortunate and lucky. And the last principle is that you serve the needy with dignity. And I think in here, Sheikh Taliep made reference to compassion, made reference to the term compassion. You do it with compassion. So I think just touching and adding those two things, those few pointers to the presentation that was made earlier. I'd like to now go on to my topic, which is relating to risk management and internal controls. Risk management is an important corporate governance principle, and I think Suleman Badat made reference to that on a few of his slides. And that is important for the sustainability of the NPO and the work it does. The first aspect of risk management is that firstly, you need to you need to identify the risk that the NPO or PBO is facing and have a risk register that registers all the risks that you believe are critical or key risks for the organization. And also not only risk, but you also need to list some of the opportunities that exist. So, normally people think risk is only the downside type part of the risk. There's also upside to risks as well, which is the opportunities. And in here, you need to list strategic risks. You need to list environmental risks and operational risks that faces the organization. And you need to, against each one of the risks that you've identified, you need to list the type of mitigating action or internal controls you have in place to either leverage on the opportunity of that risk or to mitigate the downside of that risk. And I just want to touch on one item because of limited time. We can't go into a whole laundry list of risks, but I want to touch on one big risk that NPOs faces. And again, Suleman Badat made reference to that in his presentation, and it relates to succession planning. In my view, many NPOs do not have proper or adequate succession planning, and it is a big risk for the NPOs. Many NPOs fail as a result of not having a good succession planning as a risk and doing something to mitigate that risk. They're either dependent on individuals, and when that individual goes or dies, the organization goes with them. you know, there's no sustainability or continuity, and the good work that that person has done or the organization has done comes to a standstill. Or alternatively, another thing that happens quite often is that that leadership of that organization passes from one family member to another, often from the father to the son. And again, the principles which Suleman Badat raised is around checking on the skills, expertise, and so on and so forth. Never comes to mind. You just pass it from one generation to another. And again, it's not a sustainable sort of way of dealing with succession planning. The second aspect relates to the internal control. And again, here I just want to give a few brief comments. Very important. Internal controls are good checks and balances, and it's very important in order to build the confidence and the trust the community builds and of the organization over a period. The NPOs are often serving community, and the community needs to have trust and confidence in the work that the NPO is doing. And internal control is a critical element of building that trust and confidence. One aspect that again I'd like to touch on as an example, and there are many internal control issues that you can list, but it's issues of conflict of interest and segregation of duties. Often this is lacking in many NPOs. A lot of things is done on the basis of trust, and to be honest, you can't just leave things on trust. You have to have checks and balances in your system that make sure that things are done properly, and that the one is checking the work of the other. And this also avoids a lot of things of corruption and fraud that from happening in NPOs. So policies and procedures are important. You need proper segregation of duty. Just as an example, we find quite often in many NPOs where the same person receives the cash, makes out the receipts, go and do the banking, and do the actually disbursements of those funds. And really, there's no segregation of duty, and there's no proper accountability from that perspective. So that's quite an important aspect to consider from an internal control point of view. And I'm just highlighting one of them, you know, to consider. So I close on the basis of just sharing two examples from a risk management point of view, which is the issue of succession planning, and from an internal control point of view, which is the issue of separation of duty and conflict of interest that needs to be managed. Jazakallah. Zaino, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan. Jazakallah Shauket, I think you've really touched on the issue of risks, the strategic, environmental and operational risks. And also, I think what we listen to perhaps later on is what type of mitigation policies should be adopted by NPOs when they consider some of these risks. Okay, over to our next speaker, and Jazakallah to Brother Shauket. Our next speaker is Sister Fatima Abba. Sister Fatima Abba is also a qualified chartered accountant and an IFRS specialist. I think many of you know what IFRS is. With a passion to improve governance in NGOs or NPOs. She currently serves as a board member on the Accounting Standards Board, as well as the Mikulu Child Development Trust. Her experience and passion in NGOs stem from previously being actively involved in SANZAF as Gauteng Treasurer, as well as FaithWorks. But before I hand it over to her, I'd like to say and compliment SANZAF for actually being awarded the 3G Code on Corporate Governance. I think this was quite an achievement for a South African NGO to have this particular award. And I think we need to all applaud and say takbir to Shauket Fakie and his team at the South African National Zakah Fund. Jazakallah khair for that. Barakallahu feek. And over to Sister Fatima Abba.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. The topic that I'm going to talk about today is assurance, and that has a lot to do with where I am currently, which is in an external audit function. Now, a lot of us understand assurance to be two parts to it. The first is the external audit function, which I think we're all quite familiar with, where we try and get an audit firm to come and have a look at our financial statements and our accounting records. And as Brother Faizel spoke about, there's a very big importance, particularly from who we serve, our donors and our community, the Department of Social Development, often SARS. They have a lot of interest in our financial statements. And the benefit of getting an external audit to come and look at it is exactly the fact that they're external to your organization, that they have an independent look to see whether your financial statements are appropriately prepared, that you've got good accounting records. And really their focus is around your financials, so your information on financial accounting. And so we understand that benefit, and a lot of our organizations are already doing that. The importance of that is to try and do it as timelessly as you can as soon as your year end is over, because the quicker you issue financial statements, the more comfort your donors get that your information is up to date, it's accurate, it's ready to be looked at any point in time. And that's the benefit of an external opinion. The other side of assurance that we need to think about is internal audit. Now, internal audit doesn't have to be a formal function or an expensive exercise. It can be done by volunteers that we've got the right capabilities, as Brother Suleman spoke about. It can be done by someone else in your organization who's not involved in the finance function, or it can be done as a paid function. But really the benefit of internal audit is to really go and unpack what your internal controls in your organization look like. And to give you an example, so if you have an organization that collects zakah, and their focus of their zakah is a number of projects, and a donor arrives and provides a donation for zakah for bursaries, for example. As a donor, you want to know that your money is going to be used for zakah, for someone who's eligible for zakah, and that actually the money is going to be used for someone who is going for a bursary. And the benefit of good internal controls is that as an organization, you've set up your welfare workers to make sure that every eligible beneficiary is actually eligible for zakah, and that they're doing the right processes and balances and checks in the background to make sure all of that's being done. And what an internal audit function will come and do is to actually just do a check on that. So go back into the files to confirm that the recipient is eligible, that the recipient actually received it for a bursary, and that the time it took for the money to be distributed is appropriate for what the donor wanted it to be. Now, the benefit of that is that an external audit would only have looked at the money coming in and the money going out. But the internal auditor would actually have spent the time making sure all the rest of the controls are in place and actually functioning appropriately. That the welfare worker has actually done the diligent due checks, has gone out and visited the recipient, and that there's comfort that the person is eligible for zakah. This gives us comfort around donor abilities, be much more comfortable around the work that you've got. Your recipients feel comfortable that they're receiving money that they're actually entitled to, particularly if someone isn't eligible for zakah. The other thing about internal controls and what an internal auditor can do for you is to actually go and look at controls that are not financial. So Uncle Shauket spoke about succession planning. As a governance board, you put a plan together around succession planning. Your internal auditor can come and check and confirm that you're following your own policies, that you are assessing capabilities and experience of new governance members on your committees, that they've got the right skills, the right experience. However you've defined your policy, they come and do those checks for you to confirm that you're following what you've stipulated as your policy. And overall, as a society, we all take comfort from the benefits that internal and external audit give us from the donor perspective, from other interested parties in terms of overall community, from a recipient perspective, from the government in terms of the Department of Social Development. And that to me is the benefit of assurance. And it doesn't really need to be an expensive exercise. It just needs to be a well thought out exercise. And in terms of maybe rotationally testing your controls, but making sure that you have them in place and that someone is having a look to make sure that they're functioning effectively. Thank you, Uncle Zainul.
Okay, Jazakallah, Fatima. I think this is also a very important part of corporate governance, that we have our annual audits, that we also have internal audits, and many organizations don't actually have internal audits. And it would be interesting to find out actually how many do have internal auditing as part of their processes. The non-financial controls that you mentioned, I think, are also important, and we need to make note of these. And perhaps when this document does come up, I think non-financial controls should be given some special attention as well. So Jazakallah khair again. We're going to go on to our next speaker, Brother Farid Jassat. He is the founding and managing director of a firm of attorneys in Parkwood, Johannesburg. He has been in practice for the past 32 years, wow, 27 of which at the firm he established. So he is an entrepreneur as well, and he's involved in litigation and commercial work. Farid is also involved in an NPO where he holds a position of secretary and has presented several training programs for clients on issues of the NPOs as well. Over to you, Brother Farid. And your section deals mainly with compliance and legal and regulatory aspects of compliance. Thank you.
That's correct, Zainul. Thank you. And assalamu alaikum to the audience. And I must thank AWQAF and AMAL for putting this webinar together on what I think is an extremely important issue. Now, my task is to deal with the legal aspects and legal compliance, and that is dealt with in the King Code under Principle 13. Now, as individuals and as organizations, we know that we've got to comply with the law. Failure to comply with the law can lead to disastrous consequences. One could attract civil liability. One could also attract criminal liability as an organization and as individuals. So we've got to take this particular principle very, very seriously, because it could have some serious consequences for PBOs and individuals who are involved in the running of PBOs. I think a good starting point would be to look at Principle 13 as it is in the King Code and try and break that down a bit and see how we can extend it and expand it to the NPO, Islamic NPO environment. Now I'll read what Principle 13 says is that the governing body should govern compliance with applicable laws and adopted non-binding rules, codes and standards in a way that supports the organization being ethical and a good corporate citizen. Let's just break that down a little bit. What it's saying is that we've got to comply with two facets in order to achieve two objectives. And the two facets that we need to comply with are laws, and that's obvious, but it tells us to go a bit further. It says adopt ethical rules and standards. So you've got to develop your governance framework, just don't keep to the law. And then what it's suggesting is that after you comply with the laws and codes, it must be done in such a way to support the organization being ethical and a good corporate citizen. Now the question of law, the compliance with law, that needs no explanation. I mean, that's the law of the land, and we all need to comply with the law of the land, and we have no choice about that. The second part is quite important, because what it says is that we've got to adopt principles, codes, and develop the framework, the ethical framework of the organization. Now, as Muslims, I think we're very fortunate. We've got the Sharia code, and the Sharia helps us develop that particular framework. There's a comment made earlier on that the Sharia, the King Code is, in a sense, or reads like a Sharia document. Now, with developing the code, there are two aspects that we need to have two outcomes. One is that the organization must be ethical, and the second is that the organization must be a good corporate citizen. Now, I think the most important part is how, and the million-dollar question is, how do we achieve compliance? I think first and foremost, we must adopt these principles in your founding documents. So if it's in your constitution, if you have a constitution, adopt it in your constitution or by way of resolution. The second thing that one could do to adopt these principles or to assist with compliance on the legal side is to consult with lawyers, to establish relationships with the lawyers, and to have ulama assist you with that. And the third option would be to co-opt lawyers. I think that the cheapest option and the wisest option would be to co-opt lawyers onto committees to assist. I think I need to go back a little. You know, we need to expend the King Code, and the way we do expend the King Code would be through the Sharia. So the code would read, or Principle 13 would read in a governance code for Islamic NPOs. It would read as follows: the governing body should govern compliance with Sharia and applicable statutory laws, codes, and standards that supports the organization being ethical, a good corporate citizen, and to be managed and conducted in accordance with the Sharia. So what we need to do is establish the Sharia in our corporate governance principles for Islamic NPOs. I think that then concludes you know, my segment, and thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, Jazakallah, Brother Farid, and I just wanted to mention that Farid also heads up the Johannesburg branch of AMAL. Thank you so much. I think the issues of ethics and being a good corporate citizen and of course compliance are all very important issues that you've raised. And I think when we go on to our next speaker, Brother Mohamedy, he's also a chartered accountant, and he is going to be actually focusing a lot on ethics in his little section that he's got. We've allocated 3 minutes each, but I think obviously it does seem that 3 minutes is not sufficient time. But hopefully, you know, we are eating into our Q&A time. There are lots of questions that have come in. I can see at least about 50 questions that have come in. But hopefully, after Mohammedy's session, we'd be able to actually address those questions. So Mohammed is a consultant and has completed an advanced strategic management program at IMD and the GIBS Global Executive Development Program. He was appointed as the interim group CEO of Transnet, which is our our state enterprise, and has been the former CFO as well. Since 2009 to he was also tasked primarily with rebuilding the credibility of the institution post the state capture debacle in South Africa with the stewardship. So over to you, Brother Mohammed.
Assalamu alaikum. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, loudly and clearly.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think, you know, the issue of ethics is at the heart of any governance framework that one would put together. And so, you know, we have to talk about the definition of ethics. It's normally defined as a system of moral principles that encompass honesty, integrity, and fairness. But it also is a system of repetitive behaviors that are morally correct. And this is quite important. From a Sharia perspective, we have the Quran as our code, and we have the life of Nabi Karim Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam as the example, the true example. As Muslims, we are instructed to guard ourselves, but we are also instructed to guard our behavior, our intention, and even our thoughts, both in the private perspective as well as our public life. We as Muslims have a principle of what I call automatic control or auto control, because our belief is that Allah is all knowing and all seeing, and no action of ours goes undetected. And at the heart of ethics is this principle that we do what is right. In recent years, as Brother Suleman touched on and alluded to earlier on, we have seen the debacle of state capture in South Africa, which has cost the country billions of rands, hundreds of billions. 10, 20 years ago, we saw in the United States, WorldCom and Enron go bust. Close to $75 billion was lost to that economy. Closer to home, we had the Steinhoff debacle, 200 billion rand wiped off. And this is people's money, not necessarily only executives. This is also pensioners, investment funds and the like. 2019, we saw 90 to 95% of the value of Tongaat Hewlett's being eroded from the JSE. And you go to understand why all of this occurred. and you will find fraud, error, and human manipulation, which is at the core of poor ethical values of those executives, including those audit firms that signed off on those balance sheets. And this is in an environment where there's a perception of strong governance frameworks and codes. So how much more careful must an NPO or a PBO be with ethical standards and having proper governance frameworks to ensure that none of these kind of things ever happen again? As Muslims, good ethics and morals are part of our life, part of our DNA. We have to ensure that we have the concept of being beyond reproach, not even just be having good moral conduct. We have to be beyond reproach. Volunteers and employees of organizations must be extra careful, because we in the NPOs, in the NPO space, are dealing with community monies, public funding. So we have an extra obligation to be even more careful. The strength of an organization, in my humble opinion, is dependent on the strength of the individuals that make up that organization. In the old days, we were told that there's no I in team. Today, without an I, there's no team. And if the I is bent, then the team is bent. And that's ethics and the moral standards of individuals. Transparency is absolutely key for all NGOs. There's a number of questions that have come up about transparency. How do we keep people informed? What is transparency? Well, the more information that you have out there and the more you stand up to scrutiny, the better it is for an organization. And generally, this all goes to ethics of the individuals and the leadership of organizations. The guide of the heart, all of us must actually focus on that being the guide. We shouldn't be going out to look for too many opinions and options available from different people, so that we look for the loophole that can allow something to happen. For example, somebody earlier on, one of the panelists and speakers spoke about lending the bucky. You've got to do what is right, and that which is within the concepts of honesty, integrity, fairness, and moral correctness. A key question for us all when we execute any transaction, when we do anything within an NPO, is how will I answer to Allah on the final day? So when we talk about this, we generally speak about ethics at philosophical levels, but we need to talk about ethics on a practical level. As I said, volunteers, employees, leaders of organizations, NPOs need to be extra careful, whether it be utilizing the pen that the NPO pays for, taking that home and not returning it, whether it's the utilization of other resources that belong to the NPO for personal benefit. These are ethically unacceptable practices. And this is where we have to also ensure that from a Sharia perspective, we follow the Sharia first, because the ethics follows Sharia. This is not some new concept that has been developed outside of Sharia. So when we talk about being paid by our employers and then not actually fulfilling that time obligation to our employees, those are the things where we start from for ethics. We don't have to look at ethics just from a philosophical perspective. Practically, we have to implement these ethics and the principles. So I think that is really my input into this at the moment. Jazakallah khair.
Okay, I think we're actually on to the next session, which is the Q&A session. Question here. I think to kick off, I would just like to ask one question, and that is to start off with Brother Suleman Badat. One of the questions is that implementing good governance costs money, which many NPOs can't afford. And the accusation is also that, the King Code is probably for very big corporates. How would you address that? What guidance can you provide on this?
Thank you, Zainul. That's a question. That's a question we get often. And I think my standard response is, let's turn it around and let me ask the question: what is the cost of not implementing good governance? I think most of the speakers have actually alluded to this, reputational damage, non-compliance with laws and regulations, financial sustainability at risk, fraud and corruption, and really in the worst case situation, the collapse of the NPO. So really those are the consequences of not implementing good governance. So for me, implementing good governance must be seen as an investment and not a cost. Investment in the future and the sustainability of the organization. And yes, if one looks at the King Code, and one of the things we want to do with the code we are developing is to make it a much more user-friendly document as opposed to the King 4 code. Okay, so yes, many of the principles, even in the King 4 code, are not as complex as they appear to be. I must say, many of these principles don't really require a significant outlay of cash. So then, from my point of view, is that the starting point for this is a commitment from the governing body to adopt good governance, to commit to the NPO being a well-governed NPO, and the rest will flow from there. Jazakallah Zainab.
Okay, Jazakallah for that. Okay, here's a question about trust and the trust in leaders. So probably one of the purposes of good governance is to ensure that the public can trust leaders to what they are supposed to do. For example, their fiduciary duties. So if King 4 and other governance and compliance tools failed in South Africa to protect the country from fraud and corruption in leadership, then how would it be different in Muslim structures? Perhaps Islamic law has better governance tools. So perhaps if I'd like Shauket to come in on this one here, since you've been really involved with the Auditor General and perhaps in terms of the leadership, what role does this issue of trust in leaders actually play?
Yeah, Jazakallah Zainab. I think our brother Mohammed made reference to the issues of ethics and the kind of leadership qualities that one needs to have. But I think it's not one of those things only. You need to have a combination of all those things. You need to have good, trustworthy, and credible leaders leading the organization, but you can't also just depend and rely on the trust and the goodwill of the people. You need checks and balances in the system. You need good corporate governance. So you need a package that covers everything. And again, there is no guarantee that because you've adopted some of the principles of good corporate governance, that you would not have failures. It's not a guarantee in its own. But I can tell you that it is a level of assurance that both it will give you as a driver of the organization, as well as the public at large, that there are checks and balances in that system. But there's no guarantee to these things that it'll never go wrong. But when it does go wrong and you didn't have these things in place, you've got a lot to answer for.
Okay, Jazakallah. Here's another one, and this may I'd like Mohamedy to have a look at this one here. How do we encourage younger corporates or the younger generation to get involved with NPOs? And in the same light, how do we encourage non-active members to step down? Like you mentioned, that many of our organizations have people there who have been serving for many years and are not stepping down, perhaps especially trustees or life presidents and so forth. So could you address that particular question?
Zainul, Jazakallah. I think that the key here is to bring in succession right up front. When we talk about succession, I think the misnomer is that we talk about succession only as it relates to the leadership. If something were to happen to them, that's too late. That's too late to have that discussion, because then you're actually getting into power struggles, not succession discussions. You need to actually have a proper succession plan developed a long while before anything can possibly happen. So I know death is in Allah's hands, but we need to plan and have strategies. One way to bring the youth into institutions and organizations is to bring them in to shadow the older generation, or the ones that are more wise, if you want to call it that. You know, when they're in their late teens and early 20s, that's when you need to bring them in. And you bring them in as shadow assistants and volunteers into these programs. That's the first suggestion that we have. In terms of non-active members, I think, you know, we as Islamic institutions need to be firm, and we need to be transparent, and we also need to be, you know, clear with those that are not assisting to step down. They occupy a position and they're actually not value adding, then they should step down. And that's one of the clear challenges we have in NPOs today. People that are sitting as life members, or whether you want to, whether they're there and people find it difficult to tell them because they've been part of the founding membership of an organization 30, 40 years ago. That shouldn't be the case. We should all, I think Brother Shauket touched on it right at the outset of his presentation when he spoke about the fact that we should be in it for only one purpose, and that is Allah's pleasure. And for His purpose, not any individual or ego purposes. So I think, you know, that we got to have the courageous conversations with those that are occupying positions where they are non-active or inactive, for them to step down and bring the youth in a lot earlier to shadow those that are in positions of leadership in our organizations.
Okay. I think this question here, the next question here, may require two people to actually respond. And I'd like Sheikh Ighsaan to have a look at this as well. So you mentioned also that, or in some of the presentations, a conflict of interest. So the next question is about a conflict of interest. So from a general perspective, from a King IV perspective, as well as from a Sharia perspective, how would this actually, is there a conflict between the Sharia and the general notion of a conflict of interest between what a trustee or a leader of an organization may or may not do in terms of transactions that they may get involved with, and how should that actually be treated, either from a ethics point of view, from a Sharia perspective, and maybe the two of you could engage on this between Sheikh Ighsaan and perhaps either any one of your the esteemed panelists could actually jump into this one. Yeah.
Yes, Angazeno, maybe okay. I'll try and kick off on that one. So right. I think in the first instance, the question of conflict of interest, of course, speaks directly at the consideration of ethics and ethical considerations, and how it applies within the context of any kind of organizations, NPOs. I think the first and foremost consideration from a Sharia perspective is, of course, you know, relevance to our code of conduct, or akhlaq, our accountability, the fact that your consciousness, you know, from a fiqh perspective, when the question of leadership comes up, the overriding kind of principle that is always referred to is in fact the principle of taqwa, for example. But these are, of course, in classical kind of manuals of fiqh. And so leadership is kind of underpinned by one of these, or this as a major sort of qualification and prerequisite that a leader should have. And so conflict of interest is supposed to be navigated then from a perspective of an individual's own sense of consciousness of his creator, etc. But by the same token, as we have said, it cannot, and I think as Uncle Shauket Fakie has referred to, it cannot only be confined to a personal sense of oversight of the individual, but that there obviously needs to be checks and balances in place. And so again, from a Shari perspective, that which is within the best interest of the organization and the individuals within that organization and the stakeholders that the organization serves is once again what would govern and inform the kind of policies that the institution and the organization is supposed to adopt and to follow. And so those checks and balances, Uncle Zainul, I would imagine, is the content of what would shape policy. Policy will dictate precisely what constitutes a conflict of interest. I think there are certain general principles that we are governed by, certainly in the King Code, and that would, of course, as alluded to earlier, certainly have lots of resonance with our own sort of ethical principles in that regard. But policy and the development of policy is an area which is also a specific, in a sense, genre within the fiqh called the siyasa shar'iyya. So it's like not only public policy, but also sort of administrative policy. And that will be informed by the kind of standards and norms that the organization also operates and functions within.
Okay, any further comment on that from Mohammed?
Yeah, I think the issue here on the conflict of interest is again the principle that we have to keep in mind, which is to act in the best interest of the organization. And, you know, again, as I said, the guide of the heart. When an individual is sitting in a position where he has a conflict of interest, owning a business, as an example, that is transacting with an NPO, and most certainly he should be recusing himself at the very least. If he's involved in any of that decision making, he should have no role in that, because again, it is largely debatable, and most will agree that it's almost impossible to act in the interest of an organization, an NPO, when you actually have 100% shareholding in a business. And I think we should steer away from having those kind of conflicts even brought remotely close to our organizations. If the instance is that it has to be, and there's no other supplier as an example, I'm using an example, except for this particular business, which is owned by somebody who's within the leadership of that organization, then we have to make sure that there's some sort of independence brought in to review that decision to make sure that what we're doing is absolutely correct. That's what I would add in.
Okay. Here's another one. You know, we talk about good governance and we talk about risk management and ethical leadership and so forth and organizational culture, etc. But the question is, should we not also have, apart from financial reports, should we also not have what is referred to as integrated reports, that is focus on governance, or sustainability reports? In other words, your sustainable development goals, perhaps. So can you comment on this? And I'd like Fatima and maybe Suleman to come in on this. I think it relates to both areas that you've been talking about.
So Brother Suleman, I'll go first and you can come in. I think that's absolutely good practice to do, and certainly we've seen corporate South Africa go towards that direction. So one of the factors here is it would be a really good place to aim for, that we get to a point where we issue integrated reports, that we talk to our donors and our communities about our other goals, not just the financials in our financial statements. The difficulty with it is the cost factor and how you get that to be a consistent view that goes from there. And I think part of this governance code that we're looking at putting out is a suggestion that we go in that direction, and it will take time, but certainly that is our goal from this process. Brother Suleman.
Jazakallah, Fatima. I agree fully with what Sister Fatima has said. I think, Zainul, as I said in my presentation, that the NPO must have due regard for what King 4 refers to as a triple context, which was the economy, society, environment. And it just makes sense as a follow-on from there that the organization should then be reporting on how it is managing the dynamics of the triple context. And I think also touch on the changing expectations of donors. Millennials want to see a lot more transparency. They want to know how the organization is dealing with the environment, society, etc. So yes, I would strongly support the move to integrated reporting for NPOs, but I would think it would be of more value to the larger NPOs as opposed to the smaller NPOs. Jazakallah Zainu.
Okay, Jazakallah. And I think,
Zainu, can I just add one small point on that, if you don't mind? Yeah, it's Shauket here. Zainu, I think it's very important that for the larger NPOs that you do have an integrated reporting mechanism, which does not only just report on how much money you've collected and how much money you've spent. It's got to try and provide some context on some of the projects and programs that you have undertaken, and some of the challenges, successes, and the effectiveness of those programs as well. I think in addition to that, some of the philosophy around the thinking of the integrated way in which that the programs are run is quite important. I give you an example within SANZAF. We provide an annual report, which the first part covers all of these things, and the latter part just covers the income, expenditure, and the balance sheet of the organization. But in the former part of the annual report, we also provide the philosophy that SANZAF has, and so the donors are fully informed about that. That we have a philosophy of empowering our beneficiaries, giving them, and a lot of the money is directed towards the development and empowerment of beneficiaries rather than just the handout. So again, when you do that and you provide that kind of info, your donors are able to turn around and say, we like what you're doing, or we don't like what you're doing, and we know that we can also shift our adjust our focus accordingly.
okay, I think we actually at the end of the Q&A session, because it's already 4:30, this is the time we're supposed to be ending. So I think basically what we still have on the agenda is a closing note from Brother Suleman Badat on the way forward and what is expected, as an outcome of this webinar and the work that has been going on in terms of developing this governance code for NPOs. So I'm going to hand over to Suleman, and I just want to assure all the people that have actually sent in questions that we will circulate all these questions to all the panelists, and wherever there are responses, these responses will be sent to you. And there we go with this poll there. Is there a need for an NPO governance code? 98% are saying yes, there should be. 2% are saying maybe. So, it's a clear indication that yes, we do need a governance code. But let's listen to Suleman on the way forward.
Zainul, Jazakallah so much. I just want to check whether, yeah, I'm not on mute. Okay. From my side, the key takeaways from today's webinar will summarize as follows. I think firstly, just the attendance and the number of brothers and sisters who participated in this webinar reflects that there's a huge interest in the subject of NPO governance. And I think the questions were so insightful. And I think what encouraged me also from the questions is that many seminars on governance I've attended, and the questions tended to focus more on the technical, tax and legal aspects. Whereas here, the questions were a lot more insightful, talking about governance principles, which was really very, very refreshing to hear. Okay. Unfortunately, time was against us. I think of the 75 odd questions we had, we barely managed to get through 10 of them. So I think time was against us, unfortunately. I was pleased to see that there was an overwhelming yes to the poll question. So that actually gives us a good mandate to go ahead with the finalization of the code with speed, inshallah, and we'll do that with speed, inshallah. I think based on the Q&A session results of the polls, I certainly think there's a need for further webinars, and I want to propose this as a way forward, need for further webinars to focus on specific elements on governance. So as opposed to a broad brush focus as we did today, maybe there's future sessions where we take deep dives into specific areas such as risk management, internal controls, ethics, compliance, strategy, etc. And I think that's something we should work around. And I think the next way forward for me is the need for a webinar where we'll present the final draft governance code for Islamic NPOs and to get endorsements. In addition, I would like to appeal to those organizations are most welcome to volunteer to assist with finalization of the governance code. The more hands we have on deck, the better. The more insights, the more perspectives will certainly enrich the content of the code. So please feel free to volunteer. And I would ask that you contact Brother Zainul Kaji from AWQAF in this regard. And I want to leave it there, Zainul, and hand back to you. Jazakallah khair.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan. So with that, we'd like to conclude, and we'd also like to say Jazakallah khairan, first of all, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for giving us this opportunity, for getting us all together in these trying times. At least, even if we were not able to meet physically, at least we were able to meet virtually. So, we really are grateful for that. We're grateful to our speakers and panelists. And I don't want to go in and mention everyone by name, but I think I should mention our technical team specifically, who has been very, very helpful, in the background: Hassanain, Mubina, Farooq, Muazza, Amina, Aslam, and Nazme. Also, thanks to all the boards of trustees and management of all our organizations, AWQAF South Africa, AMAL, SANZAF, and UUCSA, for their help and support. And of course, thanks to all the attendees who very patiently waited through and listened through all the presentations here. I'm going to ask Sheikh Ighsaan to do a final closure with a dua. And I'd like to once again, thanks to all of you, to Suleman, to Fatima, to Sheikh Ighsaan, to Farid, Shauket, Mohammed, Mohamedy, and Faizel, for all your time and your presentations. Jazakallah khairan. Over to Sheikh Ighsaan, and thanks a lot once again.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. Salawatullah wa salamu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barik wa sallim. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta. Nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. And let's join together in reciting the Sunnah conclusion with Surah Al-Asr. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wal-Asr. Inna al-insana lafi khusr. إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. وصلى الله على سيد المرسلين وإمام المتقين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
جزاك الله خيرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
When we take care of each other, wonderful things happen. Children thrive, the elderly rejoice, communities celebrate. AWQAF South Africa, a charitable waqf receiving organization, makes it easy to share the care. All donations are plowed into Sharia-compliant investments, while the fruits support a great variety of charitable causes. Visit the AWQAF South Africa website at awqafsa.org.za to discover how your waqf can bless our community with the legacy of care. AWQAF South Africa, share the care.
SANZAF, changing lives through development and relief. I act to make an impact.
الذين ينفقون أموالهم بالليل والنهار سرا وعلانية فلهم أجرهم عند ربهم ولا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون.
Recognized as the most notable expression of Islamic philanthropy, Waqf is the voluntary, permanent, and irrevocable dedication of a portion of one's wealth, in cash or kind, to provide for continuous streams of benefits to the community, both Muslims and non-Muslims. Standing out as one of the greatest achievements of Islamic civilization, Waqf is a philanthropic foundation, an integral part of Islamic society, with the mission of maximizing the value of endowments. For hundreds of years, Waqf was used to lift millions out of poverty, foster trust between the community and the donors, and served as a tool for community empowerment and poverty alleviation. Also known as Sadaqah Jariyah, Waqf is irrevocable, inalienable, and provides perpetual rewards that add to the social welfare of communities. It plays a significant role in creating a sustainable economic model for future generations, whilst covering a wide range of public services like clothing, food, shelter, education, and healthcare, which have a direct bearing on economic growth and quality of life.